Hello, hello. Welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Gregory, your host, and today is a Q&A episode. I love Q&A episodes. So before we jump into some of the questions, quick announcement. The Muscle Science for Women program is live for sign up. We have had an amazing group of women already sign up, and we're super, super excited to get things started. The first round will be starting April 12th. So if you're listening to this and you're interested in learning more about the Muscle Science for Women program, you can go to metflexlife.com/MSW and learn more about the program, check out the course curriculum, sign up if you're interested. I will link that in the show notes. I think that's the only announcement I have today. And as always, I say this every time, but if you're enjoying the podcast, if you're taking value away from this episode specifically, please make sure to share it out to anybody that you think would be interested in it and would find value in it as well. And if you are listening and you want to take a screenshot and add it to your Instagram story, you can tag me at rachelgregory.cns. I'll share it out as well. And that helps to spread the word about the show. And lastly, if you haven't left a rating and review on iTunes, that also helps the show grow. So definitely please head over to iTunes and do that. If you can, I would really, really appreciate it. All right, let's get into the questions for today. Super excited about these. All right, first question today. How does intermittent fasting work for muscle preservation during a fat loss period? Okay, this is a great question. As always, it depends, and there's a few different factors that we can chat about for why it depends. The first one would be, first chatting about, what is the most important thing, or what is one of the most important things to think about when you are going into a fat loss phase to preserve muscle. And I would say that on the top of the list is making sure that you are resistance training, right? Because we know resistance training sends a signal to your body to hold on to as much muscle as possible or build as much muscle as possible. So when you're in a fat loss phase, resistance training is super, super important so that when you're in a deficit, you're not losing muscle mass, right? We don't want to lose muscle mass. We want to lose body fat. So sending that signal to your body that says, hey, hold on to this muscle as much as possible, that comes mostly from resistance training and also from adequate protein intake. So those would be the top two things to definitely make sure that you're on top of when you're going into a fat loss phase, when you want to preserve as much muscle as possible, resistance training effectively and, enough to send that signal to your body that says, hey, hold on to this muscle, and then getting enough protein. I generally recommend for most people, it's around 1 gram per pound of body weight. If you have a lot of body fat to lose, you can probably bring that down to around 0.8 grams per pound of body weight. So, getting into this question a little bit more in terms of the fasting piece of things. So I think it depends when it comes to fasting in a fat loss phase to preserve as much muscle as possible. I think one of the things you have to think about is, how long you're fasting for, right? So are you doing intermittent fasting, in a 12-hour window, in a 14-hour window, in a 16-hour window, or more than that? And then also, how frequently are you doing this? So if you're intermittent fasting, every single day for a long period of time, that is going to, alter things as well, right? So the longer you fast and the more frequently you fast, the more likely you are to potentially lose muscle mass, or make it harder to preserve that muscle versus if you were to be, fasting in short bursts or not as frequently, right? That kind of just makes sense. Another thing to think about is your body size, right? So how much body fat do you have? That is going to play a big role in how much muscle you lose if you are intermittent fasting, right? So if you have, you kind of have to think about this practically, right? The leaner you are and the longer you fast, the more likely you'll pull energy from your muscle because you just don't have as much body fat on your body to basically, quote unquote, feed you when you're fasting, right? So muscle takes energy, right, to maintain and build. And if you don't have adequate energy coming in or adequate energy stores on your body, then if you're fasting for long periods of time and too frequently, you could risk, that energy being taken from that muscle mass, right? So I think body size is a huge piece of it. If you are, like I said, on the leaner side, I think you need to definitely be more careful with how much you're fasting and how long you're fasting, how frequently you're fasting. If you have a lot of body fat to lose, and you have a lot of extra body fat stores that can quote unquote feed you, right? Then it makes sense that you could probably, get away with more fasting without losing as much muscle mass, right? So that just kind of makes sense if you think about it practically. And then I think also, as I mentioned before, it also depends on how much you're eating when you are not fasting, right? So making sure that you are getting enough fuel in terms of calories and protein to preserve as much muscle as possible in a fat loss phase, right? So we know if you're looking to lose body fat, you have to be in a deficit. I think it's important to think about, how aggressive that deficit is for you personally. And you can think about, a percentage. I like to look at percentage of body weight per week with clients when we're looking, at that scale number. It's definitely not the end all be all. The scale is just one metric. But if we're talking in scale numbers, thinking about, losing about 0.5% to 1% of your body weight per week is generally a good place for most people. I would say if you're on the leaner side and you have less to lose, then moving down to around 0.5 to 0.75% of your body weight per week is probably a little bit of a safer place to be. And then if you have more body fat to lose, you could probably even go up to like 1.25% of your body weight per week. But the reason why we're using percentage of body weight versus just saying, lose 1 to 2 pounds per week is because it's all relative to you, right? And your body size. So it's important to think about that if you are thinking about the scale number. But again, the scale is just one piece of the puzzle, right? We need to look at body tape measurements. We need to look at progress pictures, how your clothes are fitting, how you're feeling. Those things that matter just as much, or I would say even more than that scale number when it comes to losing body fat and also, maintaining that loss for, an extended period of time, right? You don't want to obviously lose body fat and then gain it all back, right? So you have to be strategic about that. And then also just, talking to fasting. Fasting is catabolic, right? That just means, it's catabolic means breaking down, anabolic means building up, right? So fasting is a catabolic process. And if you're not combating that with an anabolic stimulus for your muscles, which is what I just talked about, eating enough protein and resistance training, then they will break down, right? You will lose muscle if you are not sending that signal to your body, hey, hold on to this muscle. Those signals come from resistance training and feeding yourself enough protein and not being too aggressive with your approach, depending on you as an individual, right? So that's just something, those are just some things to think about if you are intermittent fasting in a fat loss phase. Also realize, intermittent fasting isn't magic. It's a tool for fat loss. It's mostly an adherence tool when we're talking about fat loss specifically. I do think that fasting, has benefits outside of fat loss in terms of autophagy, cell regeneration, health benefits, longevity, all of that. But when we're talking about fat loss specifically, intermittent fasting is not magic at all. It is just a tool. Some people do well with it, others don't. You really just need to test and see, what works for you. For me, for example, and for some of my clients, we like to incorporate intermittent fasting, as an adherence tool to adhere to your overall weekly caloric intake that we want you at to be losing that body fat in a smart, efficient way, right? So, making sure that you're incorporating fasting so that it works for you and your lifestyle. So for me, for example, I'm actually in a current fat loss phase right now, and I've, tested out different methods for myself. I kind of know how I react to certain things. And for me, I'd much rather, if I'm looking at my weekly caloric intake in a fat loss phase, obviously we know calories are going to be lower because I'm in a deficit. So for me, I like to, go out to dinner on weekends, right? I like to have a little bit more calories to work with on weekends versus during the week, especially if I have a rest day or something. I might bring my calories down a little bit because I just don't need as much energy during that time. So that might be a day that I'm fasting or I, incorporate intermittent fasting fasting where I, don't eat breakfast. I also tend to not be as hungry in the morning. This goes back and forth though. There's some weeks where I'm really hungry in the morning, so I kind of try to listen to my body and fuel myself appropriately. Then there's other weeks where I'm not as hungry, so I'll push off my first meal to have more calories later on in the day. I also, like I mentioned, on rest days specifically, if I'm not exerting myself as much, in the gym, for me, having a little bit less calories on rest days makes sense, just for my hunger wise. And then that allows me to have more calories on other days. Not saying that you have to have less calories on rest days than on your workout days. Again, it's not magic. It's just, it all depends on you as an individual and what you can adhere to best. Adherence is the biggest piece when it comes to setting yourself up for a successful fat loss phase. And using these tools and strategies, intermittent fasting being one of them, is just that, a tool. It's a strategy. It's different for everyone. Another example is with myself and my clients, we utilize something called PSMF days, which are protein-sparing modified fast days. I've talked about this in the past, but it's basically you are incorporating a PSMF day by consuming adequate protein intake, so generally around like 1 gram per pound of body weight, and then you're basically bringing your calories down to around 1,000 calories for that specific day, while making sure that you're hitting your protein goal. So focusing on lean protein sources and maybe like just low calorie foods like non-starchy veggies, having some hunger hacks on hand. So I will link, I actually have a guide to hunger hacks on my website. So I'll link that in the show notes. If you go to metflexlife.com, you can download that for free. And PSMF days are really just a way to get a chunk of your deficit out in just 1 day per week. So for me, like I mentioned, I like to go out on weekends and have a nice dinner out, Friday and Saturday nights. And that requires having a little bit extra calories to work with. So during the week, if I do a PSMF day, I can basically take out a chunk of my deficit calories on that day and have more calories on the other days of the week, which for me, that helps with adherence because I find it easier to restrict one day versus restrict on 7 days across the board. But again, that's just me. And again, it comes down to what you can adhere to best. So again, I feel like I just said again 3,000 times. It depends on you, right? And I think it really is important to test these strategies out and see, what you feel best with. Because when we're talking about fat loss and we're talking about being in a fat loss phase or a period, you have to find what's going to be sustainable for you and what's going to allow you to adhere to that caloric intake as easy as possible, right? And so we also know that calories don't reset overnight. I like to look at calories on a weekly basis, and especially when it comes to fat loss specifically, that is what matters most, right? So having, lower calories on a certain day, higher calories on another day, if that works for you and your lifestyle, then I think that's totally fine as long as you come out at the end of the week within the range that you want to be in for your total weekly caloric intake. All right, so I'm going to stop rambling on because that was a long-winded answer to that question, but all in all, with intermittent fasting and muscle preservation, it all depends on how long you're fasting for, how frequently you're fasting for, your personal body size, so how much body fat you have to lose versus if you don't have that much body fat, how much body fat you have to lose. So if you have more body fat versus someone else who has less body fat, it probably makes sense for this person who is leaner to be a little bit more cautious of fasting for long periods of time to make sure that we do preserve as much muscle as possible. And then lastly, making sure you're sending those signals to your body to hold on to that muscle. So resistance training and adequate protein intake. And then also, I didn't mention this, but recovery, right? Making sure that you're recovering properly. That's obviously a big piece of everything when it comes to changing your body composition, transformation, all of that. So really making sure that you're on top of your sleep, your stress management, all those recovery tools is also going to be super, super important to ensure that you're, preserving as much muscle as possible during a fat loss period. I hope that answered your question. All right, this next question is another fasting question. Someone asked, thoughts on early morning fasted workouts? Okay, so just like in the last question, I think it's definitely very highly dependent on the person and how they feel during their workouts, right? So some people feel great training fasted and others don't. And I think that it also really depends on your main goal, right? So like we talked about in the last question, the main goal was fasting in a fat loss phase. So the fat loss phase and the fat loss was the main goal at that time. So, thinking about what is your main goal right now, and, how can you basically tailor to that goal to make it to make your results as efficient and as effective as possible, right? So are you actively trying to build muscle, or are you in a fat loss phase and trying to preserve muscle? Right? Those are like kind of the two things that you want to think about. Usually, people are either looking to build muscle, or they're in a fat loss phase, looking to lose body fat and preserve muscle. Or if you're just looking to maintain where you're at, you're also probably looking to, build muscle usually, right? So anyway, just kind of thinking about those two things. If you're in, a building phase or a fat loss phase, or if you're at maintenance trying to build muscle, you want to kind of just think about what is going to be most advantageous for the specific goal at this specific time, right? So if we're talking about training, should you train differently for these goals? No, not necessarily, especially, if you're going into a fat loss phase. A lot of people tend to think that you have to completely change up your training. I would argue against that. You definitely want to continue training as hard as you can. Obviously, if you're doing lots of, high intensity training and high intensity work, you might want to dial that back, just because we know in a fat loss phase, you're going to have less recovery resources available. And so you don't want to kind of over stress your body in that particular way. Obviously adding a lot of stress in a fat loss phase, because you're already in a deficit. You're already adding a stress to your body by just being in a deficit. So, if you were in a, building phase or at maintenance, you had lots of fuel coming in, you could probably get away with more high intensity exercise and workouts. Going into fat loss phase, you might need to dial that back. But in general, when it comes to lifting specifically and resistance training, you shouldn't be thinking about training differently going into a fat loss phase versus if you were just at maintenance or in a building phase. So that's kind of the training piece of it. But if you're actively trying to build muscle, you may have more energy to train with something in your stomach versus if you're training fasted, right? So again, it all comes back to the individual and how you're feeling. So if you're actively looking to build muscle, you're in a building phase, and you're doing early morning fasted workouts, I would just ask yourself, would you perform better during those workouts if you did have something in your stomach? Because if you are looking to build muscle, you want to obviously put yourself in the best possible situation to perform your best and build as much muscle as possible and get the most out of your training session. If you're in a fat loss phase and say you're not hungry before your workout and you would rather, quote unquote, save your calories for later on in the day because that helps you to adhere better to your overall caloric intake for that day, I think that it's totally fine to, go into a workout fast, especially if it's early in the morning. But again, it really depends on how you feel during your workout. And I think it also is important to, test out different things to see what you personally feel best with, right? So if you are in a fat loss phase and you're training early in the morning and you feel good during your workouts, you feel good training fasted, then I think that's totally fine. I would say at the very least, if you're training fasted, I'd recommend making sure that you get at least a solid meal in the night before, and maybe even a pre-bed snack with a good amount of protein in it. And then after your session, making sure that you get a solid meal in within, say, 2 hours. Because if you're going into your session fasted, we just talked about this in the last question. You want to make sure that you are, recovering properly and getting enough fuel in after the session, especially or specifically protein, right? So if you're going into the session fasted, if you're in a fat loss phase, I would say just make sure that you are, consuming some type, a bolus of protein or something after your workout, at least within at least within a 2-hour period, especially if you've gone into that workout, maybe fasted 12 or 14 hours. It's much more important to get that post-workout bolus of protein in versus if you were to have protein before your workout or have a meal before your workout, then that kind of post-workout window actually gets a little bit longer, right? So that's just something to think about. And if you are someone who's training, early in the morning and you want to try out maybe adding something into your pre-workout meal or snack that's easy to digest, you can try maybe a quick digesting protein and or a carb before your session if you're training early in the morning and know that you might potentially feel better if you had something in your stomach. So for example, maybe having like a half a scoop of whey protein powder in your water and sipping on that, as you get into your training session. That's going to be quick digesting. Or you can, or if you want to have a carb source, maybe like some fruit, or a quick digesting carb, such as like a rice cake. Or if you're not a protein powder person, if you want to combine a quick digesting protein and carb, you could do maybe a rice cake with an egg on top or some egg whites. Those are just a few examples of things that are generally easy to digest. But again, it all comes down to the person, right? All comes down to how you feel. And I would say it also depends on, again, like I said, what is the main goal for you right now? Is it to build as much muscle as possible? Is it to go into your workout feeling or is it to go into your workout performing as best you can? And if having something in your stomach beforehand helps you to perform better and to feel better during your workout, then I think it makes sense to do that. If you're in a fat loss phase and you are, training early in the morning, training fasted, you aren't hungry, you still have good energy during your workouts, I would say that it's totally fine to, save those calories for later on in the day, especially if you are maybe deep into a fat loss phase and your calories are pretty low. That is something to think about too. Again, it all comes back to adherence, right? So what can you adhere best to for that overall day, and what makes it easiest for you to adhere to your caloric intake? Because we know that's one of the biggest, things to think about in a fat loss phase is making sure that you're staying within that deficit goal so that you can lose body fat. We have to be in a deficit to lose body fat, but also ensuring that you are, training as efficiently and effectively as possible, because we want you to maintain that muscle. We want you to feel good during your training, but you're probably going to have to make some trade-offs there, right? So that's just something to think about. So hopefully that answers your question. All right, next question and the last question today. What are your favorite pre and post-workout meals and why? Okay, so like we just talked about in the last question, what you consume pre-workout will be key for helping you feel your best during your training and also kickstart the recovery process after you finish training, right? So you do also obviously want, like we said, you want to be mindful and make sure you're being mindful of how much you're eating and how close to your workout it is, because working out on, a full stomach while you still have food digesting could make you feel sluggish, and it could also add to causing some GI distress. So this is where that, early morning fasted workout, if you know that you feel better training fasted, especially if you're, working out early and you might not have enough time to get a pre-workout meal in, then that's why, I think that's totally fine. Again, it just comes back to how you personally feel during your workout, what gives you the most energy, and what makes you feel best, right? It's so dependent on the person. That's why there's no like hard and fast, like, hey, do this, do that. It all depends on you as an individual. And it really takes some, trial and error to see what feels best for you. So I would definitely encourage you to test out some different things. And I'm going to chat about what I do pre-workout and post-workout, and maybe you can get some ideas from this. Before I go through my favorite pre-workout meal, I do want to chat about what you should think about when you're putting together your meal or snack pre-workout, right? So thinking about the different macros, protein, carbs, and fats. If we start with protein, we want to think about protein, consumption throughout the day. We want to evenly space that throughout the day, right? Because that's going to maximize muscle protein synthesis. Having various feedings of protein throughout the day is going to maximize I can't say that word, maximize that. So that's kind of the first thing that we want to think about when we're talking about protein, is making sure that we do have enough boluses of protein throughout the day, and adding one of those servings pre-workout is definitely a great option. So generally, this obviously depends on the person and your body size and your protein goal, but generally about 25 to 50 grams of protein, anywhere from 3 to 5 times per day, is usually a good place to be. Again, this depends on your size and your personal protein goal. So if I'm having a pre-workout meal, I generally shoot for no less than about 25 to 30 grams of protein in that meal. Again, this will help to kickstart the recovery and growth post-workout, as well as give you some energy, obviously, pre-workout. So that's something to think about in terms of protein. Carbs. So carbs, there's no, set recommendation for pre-workout carbs, and you don't technically need them, but it all depends on you and the context of your training and your goals, right? So if you train hard and you're looking to get every ounce of benefit out of your training session, consuming carbs pre-workout can give you a bit more energy, and again, kickstart that recovery post-workout by specifically refilling muscle glycogen stores. So with carbs, again, it's all dependent on, what your main goal is, where you're coming from, what type of, lifestyle you're following. If you are following a lower carb lifestyle and, having carbs, pre-workout doesn't work with your lifestyle, then that's totally fine. But again, I just want you to think about, okay, what's going to give you the best energy for your workout for you, right? So going with, like, for me, for example, even when I was following more of a strict low carb diet, right now I'm not following a strict low carb diet. But if I was, back when I was following like a keto or a low carb diet, I would still consume carbs pre-workout and post-workout. I would take more of like a targeted ketogenic approach, just because I knew that would give me more energy, for my workouts. So something to think about as well. But generally going with a mix, like if you are consuming carbs pre-workout and you want to get the best bang for your buck, going with a mix of carbs from both starch and fruit to take advantage of the different mechanisms of digestion and transport is important to think about as well. So there's different mechanisms when it comes to digestion and assimilation, or absorption of nutrients from different carb sources. So glucose, which would be more of the starchy carbs, versus fructose, which obviously comes from fruit. Those have different transport mechanisms within your body. So if you consume one source of fruit and one source of starch, you could basically get a little bit more out of those carb sources, because they're being transported through different mechanisms. So I've talked about this in the past. I will link the podcast that I talked about this. I think it was with Chris Barakat. We chatted all about pre-workout and post-workout as well. So I will link that in the show notes if you want to check that out. But when it comes to carbs pre-workout, getting a combination of glucose and fructose is a good idea. And then in terms of fat, so we want to avoid too much fat in the pre-workout meal, because the main reason is because it can slow digestion down a bit, and you don't want to really be digesting a lot of food when you go into your workout, like we talked about. You do need to have some fat, though, at least in my opinion. You want to have some fat to ensure that you have steady blood sugar levels throughout your workout, especially if you're further out from the workout, right? So if you're consuming a meal that's like 2 hours outside of your workout window versus having a snack that's within like 20 to 30 minutes, you can definitely, quote unquote, get away with more fat in that 2 hour meal pre-workout, because you'll have more time to digest that. And I think it also makes sense to have more fat in that meal, because if you're consuming just straight carbs and proteins without any fat source, you're going to raise your blood sugar levels. You might notice that, 2 hours before the workout, maybe you have that meal and you have great energy. And then once it gets to the workout, you have an energy dip, because you've basically digested and absorbed that food more fast. That's not a word. Digested and absorbed that food more quickly than if you were to have a fat source in there, right? So, it all depends on the person too. Some people do totally fine with having, a good amount of fat right before their workout, even if it is only 23 minutes before. Some people definitely notice that tends to add some GI distress and causes some sluggishness. So again, it all depends on you and what you do best with. And it comes back to testing things out and trying them out for yourself. So let's see what else I want to chat about in pre-workout before I get into my specific meals. Oh, salt. I always add salt to my pre-workout meal and or snack. And every meal for that matter, to ensure obviously that my electrolytes are in check. And then especially going into training, making sure that you have a good amount of salt is important because it can help to facilitate that muscle pump. And also keeping your electrolytes in check, especially if you're someone who sweats a lot, having salt pre-workout is definitely, or I definitely highly recommend it. So for me personally, my pre-workout meal, so right now and pretty much over the last 2 years, I guess, I train around lunchtime. So I work out around 11 or 12, sometimes a little bit earlier. So typically, if I'm not, in intermittent fasting, if I am consuming breakfast, I will have a pre-workout meal about 2 to 3 hours before I go work out. So I'll have breakfast around like 9 o'clock if I'm training at like 11 or 12. And recently, my favorite pre-workout meal has been, and this is something I've been eating like pretty much every single day for even, I'm in a fat loss phase right now, but even when I wasn't in a fat loss phase, I still love this meal. So it is non-fat Greek yogurt or non-fat cottage cheese or a combination of both. Sounds weird, mixing cottage cheese and Greek yogurt. Well, might not sound weird to some people, but I really like it. So I either have one or the other, or I mix them both. And that is my slower digesting protein source. So this is my pre-workout meal, which is about 2 to 3 hours before. So I have a slower digesting protein source, which is that Greek yogurt or cottage cheese. And then usually I mix in about a half a scoop of whey protein powder, which is more of a fast digesting protein. And then I'll add in a little bit of fruit. So I'll have about 1 ounce. Recently, I've been having 1 to 2 ounces of frozen blueberries. Sometimes I'll have raspberries or strawberries or fresh, but usually it's frozen just because I like the consistency of the frozen. It makes it kind of like it turns the Greek yogurt kind of into like a froyo type consistency. It's really good. So I'll have that. And then I'll add in, what I've been doing for the last year is, having kabocha squash, which if you listen to me, if you follow me on social media, I'm obsessed with the kabocha squash. So that is considered my starchy carb source. It is, has a little bit more fiber in it, and it's not as starchy as say, a traditional starchy carb source would be like rice or potatoes or whatever. But for me, I do really well with it and I really enjoy it. So I consider that my starchy carb source is the squash. And then for my fat source for that meal, I'll add in some chopped nuts. Recently, it's been chopped pecans, or I'll add in, another nut, or I'll do like a drizzle of nut butter. So that's where my fat's coming from in that specific meal. And then I'll always add salt and cinnamon on top of that as well. So that's what my current pre-workout meal has been. That's about, 2 hours before. And then if I am hungry, since that is 2 to 3 hours before, if I am, a little bit hungry as I'm getting ready to go to the gym, I walk to the gym. So it takes me about 20 minutes to get there. But if I notice that I'm starting to get a little bit hungry and I know that I have a long session, then I'll have a small snack pre-workout. So this snack would probably come around 30 to 45 minutes before the workout. And recently, again, this is only if I'm hungry and I know that I might not make it through my workout with as much energy. Right now I'm in a fat loss phase. So like I mentioned before, I'm, I have not as many calories to work with if I was in obviously a maintenance or a building phase. So I have to be strategic with how I set that up. So if I am hungry, I will have a small snack during, a maintenance or a building phase. I would probably have this small snack either way, because I want to make sure I do have, I am going into that workout as fueled as possible, especially in a building phase with my main goal of performing at my best and building as much muscle as possible. I would definitely have this snack, but right now it's just kind of if I feel like it or not. But what that snack is consisting of right now is a rice cake. So that's a fast digesting carb with obviously some salt. Usually rice cakes are salted. So I'll have a rice cake with 1 egg, which I'll either just cook the egg, in a pan and do like a an over easy egg, or if I'm short on time, I'll just put the egg in a little bowl and put it in the microwave for about 45 seconds to a minute. Pop that on top of the rice cake, add a little bit of salt, and that is a really, really good snack. Super fast digesting in terms of the rice cake. Obviously, the egg does have a little bit more one large egg has about 5 grams of fat, 6 grams of protein. But for me, I do well with that. Like, I don't have any issues during my workout if I have an egg before. If you are someone who's more sensitive to fat, you could have, egg whites instead, put like egg whites on a rice cake. So that's usually my snack. And then I'll have that in combination with a little bit of fruit. Like I mentioned, you want to have a starchy carb and a fruit carb. So I will have like 2 to 4 ounces of fruit. Recently, it's been either a small kiwi or a small tangerine. With kiwi, just to note, there is a lot of nutrients in the skin. So make sure if you're eating kiwi that you're eating the skin as well. It's something I learned recently. So that will be my pre-workout snack if I'm hungry, is just a rice cake with an egg on top, some salt, and then a piece of fruit on the side. You could also do, this is something I've done in the past, a rice cake with some deli meat, right? So some like turkey or ham, and then maybe a dollop of guacamole or avocado on top with some salt, and then maybe like a piece of fruit or a few nuts as well. That's another, like if I'm not super, super hungry, I might just do like a piece of fruit and a few nuts, which is a good pre-workout snack for me. Personally, for what I found makes me feel best during my workout, right? So it's all about finding those things that make you feel best, give you the most energy, but also keeping in mind those things that I talked about in terms of, your protein, carbs, and fat sources and what to think about in regards to that. So hopefully that gave you a little insight into pre-workout. And then let's get into post-workout. So with post-workout, you don't necessarily need to and this is something that's, gone around the fitness world for a while is the anabolic window, right? Like a lot of people have seen that, you have to slam a protein shake right after you finish working out or you're going to lose all your muscle. No, it doesn't work like that. You don't need to slam protein right after your workout, especially if you had a pre-workout meal or a pre-workout snack, because you're still going to have some of those amino acids and that energy circulating, in your system from that pre-workout meal. So the anabolic window, as people mention, is, it's way longer than it's played out to be. But one thing I would mention with post-workout is if you went into your workout fasted, and this is what we just talked about in the last question, and your goal is to optimize recovery and your muscle building potential, it is probably a good idea to get a bolus of protein in or a meal within an hour or two post-workout. So that's something to think about, right? Again, we chatted about this in the last question, but if you're going into your workout fasted, it's more important to get that post-workout meal in afterwards, within I would say an hour or two, most 3 hours, versus if you were going into the workout with already a meal in your system, then it's less important because, like I said, you'll already have those nutrients still circulating to some extent. So hopefully that makes sense. And then another thing to think about is you probably don't want to eat like a full meal immediately after your workout, right? You want to get back into, and I've talked about this before, you want to get back into that parasympathetic or rest and digest mode. That's why they call it the rest and digest mode, because that is the mode that your nervous system needs to be in to adequately absorb the nutrients that you're taking in, right? So I'd say give yourself at least 30 minutes before you eat a full meal after a hard training session. Sorry, there's a plane flying over my apartment building. So what was I saying? Give yourself at least 20, like minimum 20 minutes after a hard training session to start eating a meal, because again, you want to be in that rest and digest mode so that you can absorb those nutrients as best as possible. If you're in a sympathetic kind of flight or fight mode, which I'm going to talk about in a second, your body is it's not going to be in the most advantageous place to absorb those nutrients. So for me personally, I eat my post-workout meal between I would say an hour or two after my workout. And for me, like I said, I walk to and from the gym. So my walk back home is about 20 minutes, and that helps me to cool down, get back in that parasympathetic state, and then basically prepare myself to have my post-workout meal. So with that post-workout meal, let's break it down in terms of macros again: protein, carbs, and fats. So as far as protein, I'd aim to eat another, depending on the person and their protein goal, another 25 to 50 grams of protein within 1 to 2 hours post-workout. I generally try to get at least, like I said, same with pre-workout, at least 25 to 30 grams of protein in that post-workout meal. When it comes to carbs, with carbs, insulin sensitivity is highest post-workout. So basically, your body will be in the most efficient place to use those carbs post-workout for muscle building purposes. That's just what that insulin sensitivity post-workout means. So it makes sense to time like more faster digesting carbs post-workout. So things like potatoes, white rice, things like that will absorb more quickly. And this is probably, like I said, the most important time to consume carbs as far as timing goes. I would say pre-workout is important because if you're, getting some energy from that carbs, yes, that's from those carbs to fuel your workout and you feel good with that, then that is important. But I would argue that post-workout is probably the most important time to get those carbs in, because the reason is mostly for recovery purposes, right? So an intense training session is going to trigger a stress response. And basically when you experience stress, cortisol, which is, we know this is the stress hormone, rises, and your nervous system enters what we just talked about, a sympathetic state, or a flight or fight mode is what it's referred to as well. So in this, sympathetic flight or fight mode, your brain perceives a threat, right? And it can slow or stop other, processes that are going on in your body that are not vital to survival in this kind of flight or fight mode. So it'll slow down these processes that are not vital to either fighting or fleeing. So this means that, processes that are crucial for recovery, so things like digesting your food, hormone production, and muscle growth itself, like those are slowed down significantly when your body is in a flight or fight mode, right? So to optimize recovery, we want to get you out of that sympathetic state as fast as possible post-workout and get you into that parasympathetic rest and digest state so your body can focus on what we wanted to focus on: nutrient absorption from the meals that you're consuming, repairing damaged tissue, all of that. So timing your carbs post-workout can be really helpful for helping to decrease cortisol levels and refill muscle glycogen stores as well, to help you basically create the best environment possible for recovery and for, building muscle, or at least maintaining as much muscle as possible, right? So that's where carbs come into play post-workout. It's something that I didn't think about for a while. And when I started understanding this and realizing how important recovery was, especially with the main goal of building muscle, or, maintaining as much muscle as possible, getting into that parasympathetic state post-workout, especially if you're someone who deals with a lot of stress throughout your life and you are very stressed, whether it's in, we're all stressed, but if you are someone who's highly stressed with work, or it's just a period of time in your life that you're super stressed, carbs can be beneficial, because we know, like I mentioned, especially post-workout, your body's most insulin sensitive to take up those carbs. But we also know that carbs tend to, like I said, increase cortisol or carbs tend to spike insulin, obviously. And when you spike insulin and cortisol have an inverse relationship, right? So when you spike insulin, you can tend to bring cortisol down. And we know that cortisol is that stress hormone. So if we can bring cortisol down, that's going to reduce that stress. So it's not that cortisol is a bad hormone. There's no bad hormones. It is just, if it is elevated for a long period of time and chronically, that's where issues can come. So if you're someone who deals with a lot of stress, if you are stressed out, and you are, having intense training sessions on top of that extra stress, maybe you're in a fat loss phase, so that's another stress to your body, it might be important to think about, doing whatever you can to get into that parasympathetic rest and digest mode. And so I think, timing your carbs strategically around your workout, specifically post-workout, can be very beneficial. So I like to say, and this is something that a lot of people tend to recommend, especially, coaches that I work with, are, with your, like a good rule of thumb would be to put your carbs, like I guess about 50% of your carbs for the day around your workout, right? So, even if you're consuming, lower carbs, or if you fall in a ketogenic diet, spacing your carbs out so that you have about 50% of those carbs pre and post workout can be very beneficial for all the reasons that I just mentioned. So that's something to think about. Whatever type of diet you're following, 50% of your carbs pre and post workout is a good rule of thumb. And then we're talking about fat, similar to your pre-workout meal. It's probably ideal to keep fat just a bit lower post-workout, because again, it can slow your body's ability to digest the nutrients that you just took in from those carbs and protein. However, you still, like I said, pre-workout, you still want to have some fat to help balance blood sugar level and keep you full for, an extended period of time. You don't want to eat your post-workout meal and then be hungry an hour later. So fat is still important, for sure, but a good kind of rule of thumb with fat is to think about throughout your day, keeping fat maybe a little bit lower pre and post workout. And then in your other meals like dinner, or maybe, I guess it depends when you're training throughout the day, but in your other meals that are further out from your workout, those are the meals that, probably would be beneficial to have more fats and less carbs. So kind of just makes sense if you think about it in that way. So for my typical post workout meal, so for protein, I generally have about 4 to 6 ounces of some type of lean meat. So whether that's ground beef, usually it's like 96.4 ground beef, maybe chicken breasts, turkey, pork tenderloin, any type of lean protein. I prefer lean protein over fattier protein. And I think obviously post-workout, leaning more towards the lean protein sources will give you a good amount of protein with not as much fat. So that's probably a good idea. So I'll do like 4 to 6 ounces of a lean protein source for my protein. For my starchier kind of fast digesting carb, which I talked about in terms of post-workout, that mostly is either like a sweet potato or a regular potato, or maybe some more squash. So recently I've been doing smashed potatoes, which are just taking those little golden baby potatoes, and I boil them in some water. I do this like during my meal prep on Sundays. I'll boil the potatoes, and then right when I'm like preparing my post-workout meal, I will smash them down with just like a spoon or something and add them to my air fryer, and I'll put like a little bit of cheese and salt on top and just air fry them for like 8 minutes, and they're so good. So that's what I've been doing recently. If I don't do that, I'll do like a sweet potato as my carb source. You could also do something like white rice, or maybe a mixture of white rice and cauliflower rice to bulk it up. For me personally, I don't do too much white rice because it just doesn't fill me up. So if I'm going to do white rice, I'm going to mix it half white rice, half cauliflower rice, just to add some bulk. But yeah, so those are some options for those more starchier, fast digesting carbs. And then I'll generally add in some non-starchy carbs like green vegetables to my post-workout meal as well, just to add some bulk and some volume. So, things like zucchini, broccoli, cauliflower, those non-starchy veggies. And then in terms of fat sources, so again, I won't add too much fat to my post-workout meal, but typically it'll be like a few ounces of avocado, maybe some guacamole, or some, cheese, maybe an ounce or two of cheese. Or if I'm, if I don't want to have any of that, I'll just maybe cook my vegetables in a little bit of olive oil or butter, and that will be my fat source. And then I'll also obviously salt my post-workout meal. Salt is just as important post-workout as it is pre-workout, because it can help to shuttle the nutrients from those foods into your cells for optimal absorption. So salt is definitely not the enemy. It's been demonized for so long, but it's actually very, very beneficial. There's a book called The Salt Fix, which I highly recommend if you are concerned or interested in salt, or want to learn more about why it is beneficial. So those are just a few of my typical post-workout meals. Again, I try to keep it simple. I think that if you find foods that you enjoy, you can put them on repeat for forever, really. So I generally eat pretty much the same thing during the week, and then I'll switch it up week to week. And then I'll, like I said, go out and enjoy some dinners over the weekend. But again, if you find food that, is nutrient dense, fills you up, makes you feel good, and that you look forward to eating, then you will never have an issue. So it's all about, testing things out and trying things out for yourself. But to kind of sum up this pre and post workout meal composition, the main things are just think about the meals around your workout are ideally high protein, potentially higher carb and lower fat. And then the meals further away from your workout are still going to be, higher protein, but higher fat and lower carb. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that sums it up. And I am going to stop rambling on. Hopefully I answered your questions today. Definitely, if you have, more questions, if you want to ask a question, I usually post a question box on my Instagram story, either every week or every other week. Or if you have specific questions, you can just email me. My email is rachel@metflexlife.com, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have on future podcast episodes. And if I announced this in the intro, but if you're interested in the Muscle Science for Women program, there's still time to sign up. So I will link that in the show notes, or you can go to metflexlife.com/MSW. And yeah, that's all I got for you. If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to share it out to anybody that you think would enjoy it as well or take value from it. And I'll chat with you next time.